There, okay. So thank you for coming, and I'm glad it's a small group. We'll have some people who will join us later, and we'll be welcoming and kind to them. So the Red Cross and violence prevention is a bit of a surprise sometimes to people. And what I'll tell you about how we got into this work is that we were working for a really long time with injury prevention. So we work around first aid and water safety and swimming lessons. And about 30 years ago, there started to be more and more research looking at intentional injury to children. So when we think about first aid and water safety, we're talking about whoopsies. We're talking about accidents that happen that can harm people. And when we started looking at intentional injury, what we found was that there were some pretty familiar patterns in how violence impacts young people and how children are hurt on purpose. The other thing, we learned that a lot of childhood injury through violence is predictable. There are things that organizations have in common where abuse of power and violence are allowed to exist, and where there are common incidents and common barriers to addressing violence when it happens in organizations. So about 30 years ago, the Red Cross started looking at intentional injury to children. This became a national program. It started in BC. We moved to Alberta a little over 20 years ago. And then in the late 90s, we developed a partnership with Sheldon Kennedy. Sheldon is a hockey player. He resides in the Calgary area. He's a very fabulous man. I'm really thrilled to get to work with. He runs an organization called Respect in Sport, the Respect Group and Respect in Sport, which does training for parents, for activity leaders, and coaches about safe processes in organizations, especially in sport organizations. You're welcome. There's a handout just there on the chair. And so when Sheldon was an NHL player. He was a very talented junior hockey player from Manitoba, played mostly in Saskatchewan, and then played for the NHL here in Calgary. In the late 90s, Sheldon came forward and told the world that he had been abused at the hands of a coach. A very high-ranking coach, a real VIP in hockey. And the reason that he told was because he was here at the Saddle Dome playing a game, and he realized that his abuser had been hired to coach the junior team, and he needed to do something about it. So, when I do this risk management work, it really is in tribute to Sheldon and the bravery that it took to tell about the violence that he experienced, and then the way that he's really changed sport through telling that story and insisting that organizations get better at keeping kids safe. The other thing about risk management is the Red Cross is the world's largest humanitarian organization. We have, I think it's now 184. We just got one more, national societies. So in 184 countries in the world, there's an organization that has a responsibility to keep people safe, especially around conflict and disaster. And in 2008, one of our sister charities, Save the Children, came out with a report that found that there was pervasive abuse of aid recipients by aid workers around the world, by UN peacekeepers, by humanitarian workers, by police, by militaries. And there were Red Cross and Red Crescent societies implicated in that abuse. The abuse existed in ways that were such as trading sexual assault for water when they were the water givers, trading protection for sexual assault. And so for us, we knew we had been doing this work in Canada, and we had good protections and good facilities in Canada that we felt we had some really good skills and some good knowledge. And so that started to become part of the international aid that we give now to countries when they experience disaster or conflict, is to help them to really look at their child protection frameworks and their organizational frameworks, their staff hiring, their screening, so that they can have safer organizations, and their organizations that don't then cause harm instead of causing help to the people that they're serving. So we were doing this work internally, and what we figured out was that there was some organizations needed some help figuring out how to get the policy, how to get the back end really in good order, get our houses in order about risk and risk management. And so what I'm going to take you through today with your handout, it's not a typical PowerPoint handout. What it does is it goes through what we think of as these sort of 10 steps that organizations need to follow. I'll tell you that there's a booklet, it's about a 65-page booklet that you can download off of the redcross.ca website. You fill out a little form saying, I'd like the booklet, and then it gives you a link and you can download it. And it takes you through much greater depth about the things I'm going to talk about really briefly in about 40 minutes today. When when we think about risk management, sometimes we think about liability and insurance and accidents. I had a really interesting conversation a couple of years ago with the woman whose insurance company insures Canada's elite gymnastics teams, and it's, at the time at least, was insuring the Olympic gymnastics team. And she said, gymnastics facilities have very, very high insurance. They have, really the biggest cost of running a gymnastics club is the insurance. And she said, I'd like to know, so she asked this question, and I'll ask you, what are some of the things that could give a high liability in the gymnastics realm? Why is insurance a really big deal in gymnastics?
The risk of injury.
There could be a risk of injury to athletes, yeah? People could have falls, there could be a head injury if a flip doesn't go well. She said, yes, they have very high liability issues. The reason is that gymnasts have relatives. And relatives ignore signs that say, do not go onto the trampoline. Gymnasts have brothers and grandmas, she said. Those are the culprits, really. They have little brothers who are bored, who ignore the sign that says, do not play on the uneven bars. And they have grandmas who slip in the parking lot. She said that they have, the big liability issue in gymnastics is relatives of the gymnasts. And I thought that was really interesting. And she said the other issue, and it isn't a financial liability issue, but it's a real concern, is sexual interactions between coaches and gymnasts. And she said for her, that was the one that she was working hardest to tackle, was that there was inappropriate sexual contact between coaches and athletes, and it was making her sport unsafe. And so that was really interesting to look at, because neither of those were the things I think of. I think of hitting your head on stuff. And so neither of those are what I would expect the liability concerns to be. There's a handout for both of you. Did everybody else get the handout? Yeah? Okay. So we're going to think about interpersonal violence a little bit, and we're going to think a little bit about kind of going through some of these steps. Okay. So the first thing we think about is what are the issues, what do liability issues or risk issues look like in our organizations? So how many of you work with an organization that serves children? Are there children that use your facilities, swimming lessons, day camps? How many of you work with minors who are participants, so like 17, 16-year-olds? Yeah. How many of you work with adults? How many of you have participants who have disabilities? And how many of you have participants who are seniors? Yeah, so we're thinking, so a lot of times when we're thinking from the outside about campus recreation, we're thinking about 18 to 22-year-olds, and so from the inside you know that you're serving a broader population. We also want to think about what kinds of services. So that can range from swimming lessons, where there's a responsibility for staff to physically touch participants. We're looking at situations where there's physical interaction in terms of personal trainers or sports performance work. Yeah. We're also thinking about power dynamics. So we want to think about what do the power dynamics look like between staff and participants, between staff and staff, between participants and participants. And we just did a session about bullying that kind of got into some of those issues. So we want to think about where do we interact with these people and who interacts with them. How many of you work in an organization where there are volunteers? So one organization has volunteers. A few of you have volunteers. What do volunteers do in your organizations? What can a volunteer do? They can work in summer camps, okay?
Supervise programs.
They can supervise programs, so they can have a role that's quite similar to staff in some ways, okay. So one of the steps that we talk about is mapping. And so what mapping might look like is physically mapping your facility and thinking about where the incidents we know about that have happened, that have caused harm or caused concern. Maybe those are slips and falls. Maybe those are harassment complaints or bullying complaints. In my earlier session, which was about bullying, someone said they have a really good logbook in their facility where they write down incidents that happen. So a really good exercise can be to map those out. Are there unsafe hallways? Are the locker rooms a problem? Are there, is the problem in the staff room? Where do people feel unsafe? So one of the things we can do is we can really look at our organization and figure out where do people feel safest. We could ask our staff, where do you feel safest in this facility? Where do you feel unsafe? Is there ever a place? A lot of times women are conditioned to be more safety aware. We are conditioned as we grow up. And so you might ask your staff, is there a place where you hold your keys differently? Is there a place where you're more aware of your safety? And some of those things might surprise you. A lot of high schools have a really unsafe hallway. A hallway where groping happens, or where people raid each other, or where there's a lot of jostling. So when we ask students in the high school, which is the safest hallway, which is the hallway you avoid, that's often very eye-opening for staff. So that's a way that we might use mapping to really think about what's happening in our organization, who interacts with whom. And then the next thing we want to think about is, sorry, I just got myself out of sequence here. We want to think about understanding the problems of violence. So we want to make sure that our staff have an understanding. Sorry, for those of you, you probably all know this because you've been in sessions all day, there's a little camera that follows me around, so I have to stand more still. But this way my colleague can be in the camera. How nice for you. So when we're thinking about understanding the problem, we want to have a sense of what violence might look like. So violence in an organization might look like the abuse of power, so someone being a tyrant, tyrannical coaches or tyrannical bosses. Anybody here ever met a tyrannical boss? Slightly dinosaur-like, like little arms? No. So most of us have experienced a tyrannical boss. One of the things that we've learned is that people who have tyrannical bosses or who feel unsafe at work are, what's the problem with having an unsafe boss? People who were in the bullying session? Do you remember? When we don't feel safe at work, we are less likely to keep participants safe. So the impact of our not feeling safe is that we don't protect the participants when they tell us something's going on. So we want to think about what kinds of violence could occur in our settings. Is there anybody here who works in an organization where they know there's been a sexual harassment complaint before? Is there anybody here who works in an organization where they know there's been homophobic slurs made in their facility? Everybody's looking at me like, yeah, of course. Anybody here work in a facility where racial slurs have occurred? Anybody work in a facility where slurs based on disability have occurred? Anybody work in a facility where there's been a coach or staff and participant sexual relationship? Yeah, so those might be some of the common things that happen in some of our organizations that could lead people to be unsafe. When we think about violence, sometimes the lens we have is about physical violence, but we want to be aware of emotional abuse, so abusive behavior. We want to think about physical violence. We want to think about sexual violence and sexual harassment. We want to think about bullying behaviors and other kinds of harassing behaviors. When we're thinking about the people involved in violent acts, we want to have an awareness that there is a person being targeted by some kind of violence, and there's a person committing that violence. Sometimes we have a lot of focus on the person who's targeted, and we are less prepared to deal with the person who's inflicted that violence. Sometimes we get scared about liability or about how people will feel about us or what our reputation will be, and those can be barriers to dealing with a person who uses violence. The other thing that we really want to know is that we want people to know is that usually in sort of bullying and harassing situations, at least, usually those are somewhat performative. So usually there's an audience present. About 85% of the time there's an audience present, whether it's online or in person. And the presence of the audience fuels the incident. So the fact that the audience is there and watching, whether they're vocally watching or participating or just observing, their presence fuels the length and intensity of the bullying incident. And both the person doing the bullying behavior or harassing behavior and the target assume that the audience is on the side of the person doing the bullying. So if I am harassing my friend Scott here, if I were harassing Scott and you were all watching, I would think you were on my side, and so would Scott. So the presence of the audience actually is very impactful to the incident. It prolongs the incident. We also know that bystander intervention can be very successful. More than half of the time, some kind of bystander intervention stops the incident in less than 10 seconds. So we know that that can be really impactful. When we think about vulnerability and resilience, what are some populations, if we look at this this box here, what do you think will show up? What are some populations that might experience a higher vulnerability to violence, a higher incidence of violence? Children, yeah. What other populations? Seniors? People with disabilities, yeah. People, are you thinking of sort of ethnic minorities? Okay, so yeah, so targeting that's related to race or ethnicity, yeah. Any other populations that you think might experience a higher rate of vulnerability to violence?
It could be gender based on opposite sex.
Okay, so it could be gender-based violence, and we might include homophobic violence in that. Okay, yeah, that's a pretty good list. It depends on where you are and the population, but that's a pretty good list. The thing we really want people to know, and so we talk about disasters a lot, so we've got disasters there too. Different populations have different kinds of vulnerabilities, and it's important for our organizations to know, what do the power structures look like here? Do we have a culture where some violence is ignored or allowed, where some harassment is ignored or allowed? Who's using our facility, and what are the barriers? And is this something that any of you are working on, looking at like who uses our facility and who's missing? I certainly know, I know that's been a big focus in, I use the rec facility at the City of Edmonton, and I really noticed that they're really doing some targeted work because I think they've observed that it isn't representative of our demographic who uses the facilities. So they're really working on increasing the number of people and the demographics of the people who use the facilities. A really important thing to know about vulnerability is that vulnerability is not about these groups in general. There is not a frailty inherent in any of these groups that makes them experience more violence. There are some populations and in some situations where we turn a blind eye to violence, where we help less. And so, to give an example, when we think about children and youth and adults who are in sexual minorities, in some of our athletic facilities, homophobia is really allowed to happen, and sometimes it's part of the culture of our teams, or some of the times it's part of the culture within the coaches, where we have sort of an idea that guys are supposed to be a certain way or women are supposed to be a certain way. And there's nothing, so we know that lesbian and gay youth, for example, experience a higher rate of violence, but it's not a frailty in lesbian and gay youth. It's a frailty in our society when we protect people less often. So it's a really important thing to know when we think about vulnerable populations. Now, let's think about factors associated with resilience. What are some of the factors? Have any of you ever known somebody who was able to triumph in their life, despite maybe on paper it shouldn't have worked that way? They were just really able to get through, even though they've been dealt a really difficult hand. What are some of the qualities that you associate with people who have resilience?
Support network.
They have a support network, so they have people they can rely on. Yeah. What else? Okay, so they might have optimism. They believe that things could be different next week, could be different later. It's like the Annie example in the movie. They have, sorry?
They're looking, drive and purpose, so
They
they're
have-
looking beyond their
Yeah.
circumstances.
Do you think athletics could be a factor in resilience? Do you think involvement in athletics could be a factor? Yeah. We've been able to definitely to establish, athletics aren't the homey place for everybody, but they are for some. But definitely having belonging, having a place where people notice you, for young people, having an adult who knows your name and notices you, having a place where you show up and they're glad to see you, a place where you feel connected. Sports and athletics could be that for a lot of young people. And we know that, the battery's running out, I'm so glad. They said, the battery's going to run out. And I was like, that is so sad because I made the last group dance for the camera, and this group might not get that opportunity. They might just be dancing for themselves. So, boy, that's kind of hard to read, hey? So some of the factors associated with resilience. So assertiveness, problem solving, humor, having relationships, having community, and having a sense of culture. Athletics can be part of all of that if we do this right. athletics can be harmful too. We have a choice to make in how we're setting up our facilities, how we're structuring our teams, how we're scaffolding for there being a sense of community in our facilities. And I would say I meet as many people whose lives were changed for the good by athletics as people whose lives were changed for the worse. And so we really are at this turning point where there is this will and this desire to do this work in the right way, and we just need to have that resolve. What time is it, Carlia?
12 after.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to go through a few other thoughts about sort of these steps that we think of in our plan here. So this is kind of the protection instruments idea is a little bit wordy. One of the things you want to think about is, what are the rules? What are the rules, and how do we know what they are, and how do we know whether we're following them? So can anybody think of a rule in your organization or university or college that governs how people behave? There's a code of student conduct. Is there a code of staff conduct? Okay. Does the code of student conduct only apply to academics? No, it applies to human interaction, right? So a code of student conduct is a great example. What's another example of a university or college rule that helps to govern our behavior or hold us accountable?
Sexual harassment policies.
Sexual harassment policies or human rights policies, yeah. So when we think about protection instruments, we're thinking about policies and practices in organizations that are for safety. And also we can think about in the club, in the faculty, in the university, and then some of them might be bigger, like municipal or provincial or federal. Provincially, there is a policy in Alberta, and there is an equivalent one in every province in Canada of child protection. So in Alberta, that law says that if you know a child is being harmed by their caregivers, you have a duty to report. You have a duty to make a report to the Child Welfare Authority. In Alberta, you do that by calling the Child Abuse Hotline, which is 1-800-387-KIDS. Each province in Canada has legislation like that. So this is a really important thing if your organization works with kids. You need to know what your policies are. Some of your participants, though, are not students. So is there a code of conduct that applies to non-student participants? Is there a code of conduct that applies to volunteers the way that it applies to staff? That's really worth kind of looking into. So duty of care is a concept that people in institutions have a responsibility to make sure people in their care are not harmed, including sexually, physically, or emotionally. So one of the things we think about when we're thinking about looking at policy, maybe creating new policy, is who is the right team? Anyone in this room ever inherited some new policy written by a lawyer who didn't speak good English, or who didn't speak like everyday English, the kind of words we would use that have 10 letters or less in them? Yes. Anybody here received weird policy that you thought, this does not seem practical? So when we think about prevention teams, we want to think about who are the decision makers, who manages the budgets, who has legal expertise, who's going to communicate internally about it. And then we want to think about those subgroups. So who interacts with children if you have children that use your facility? Who interacts with students? Who interacts with seniors? So we can think about what are their perspectives. And then who can hold the group accountable? So who are those? Some of us are idea people. We can plan it all out. We know what color things are going to be. We know how fabulous the launch will be. And there's another skill set that's about project management. And it's about, in 2 weeks we'll have this, in a month we'll have that, in 2 months we'll have that. We need both of those. And the bottom one is an influential but unofficial role. Somebody tell me the name of somebody really influential in your organization because of their personality, not because of their title. Yeah? Who's somebody in your organization?
His name is Warren Kelly, and he's in student life.
Okay, and people listen to Warren?
Martin.
Martin?
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
He's crazy.
Yeah.
guy.
Okay, so we think about who are the change makers and influencers. My colleague Kevin Pace, who's teaching down the hall, he and I have completely independent spheres of influence in the world. We work in different regions. We have totally different worlds. But if I want people to be on side with something, I make sure Kevin likes it. Because Kevin will talk it up in a way, Kevin will make up a cheer with my name in it and the idea, and everybody will know it by the end of the staff meeting. So you think of who your influencers are and you get them involved. Because otherwise influencers will derail your process if they're not on board. Okay, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Normally I make you stand up and move around, but I'm going to instead make you point. Pointing is not rude in this context. So, so if you're a yes for sure, you're going to point to this side of the room. If you're an I'm not sure, maybe. If you're I don't know. And if you're there, okay. That camera is still following me. Okay, so, does your organization do criminal record checks of all personnel?
One's dealing with children.
All personnel. Okay. Okay. I really feel like you should turn around and catch them. Okay. Does your organization have a policy that addresses bullying and harassing behavior by staff? Okay. Does your organization have a process to deal with sexual harassment? Okay. Have you as a staff member ever had any training about family violence entering the workplace? What to do if a colleague is involved in family violence? Okay. Okay. No. Is there any policy in your organization that's off limits or you need special qualifications to access? Is there any policies in your organization that you need special training to access? Like if you've taken the course, you're allowed to use the special binder to deal with the sexual harassment. Okay, this is a thing I'm finding fairly common. Does anybody have work in an organization where the standard practice is if you don't know what to do, go to a certain person? If you don't know what to do, I don't know what to do with that situation either. I think Kathy probably knows about the rules. Anybody have a Kathy? An organization where there's a human you go to when you don't know the rules? Okay. Anybody? They're all pointing at you. Anybody work in an organization where that person has left? Okay. So some of the things we want to think about with risk are there policies in place? Do people know what they are? Do people feel safe to follow them? I'm always interested in VIPs. What happens for the VIP? So if we have a policy in our organization that we deal with sexual harassment a certain way, and we get a new board chair or VIP or head coach, and they're the problem, do we still follow the practice? Because I will tell you, I talk to a lot of people in organizations where that's the frailty. The rules don't apply to VIPs. I did a workshop with an amazing religious denomination. They were doing such progressive work. I worked with an entire province's clergy in this one Christian denomination. And in that denomination, they have a VIP role that's like a lifelong, it's a calling. So they have a VIP role, it's like a lifelong calling. And so people have been doing that job for a long time, and they kind of move around to different areas. And one of these, a leader of a church said, we're starting this new thing where we do crim checks if you work with people. If you're in a serving role, we do a criminal record check. And she was the first person ever to request a criminal record check for this VIP who had this very important ceremonial role in their denomination. And her board was outraged that she would insult this VIP in this terrible way. And so she sent in she got it done, she sent in all the checks, and something happened that I've never heard of happening before, which is that the RCMP phoned her the same day and said, do you know where he is? Because they had been following a trail of child abuse that this person had been committing across Canada. He had a particular interest in a population group, so he was known as a specialist in working in his case with Aboriginal youth. And he had made his way across the country for 30 years, assaulting kids. And this minister was under, I think she was a minister, was under great fire for making a VIP follow the same policies everybody else followed. And people talked about it in our training as if it was a very controversial thing. And then she said, I have a story for you. And it was really sobering to think about what happens when we involve VIPs in our process. Who are the VIPs in your facilities? What's a VIP kind of role in a university? Deans, directors, high administration. Are there elite coaching staff that can have VIP roles? Yeah, I hear a lot from facilities that have recruited a very important coach, and then the staff are trying to figure out what the heck to do about their behavior. Maybe it is abusive language. Maybe it is humiliating athletes. Parents sometimes can be VIPs. So sometimes in some of our facilities, parents can cause real problems for our kids, and we sometimes are struggling with how to deal with parent behavior. When parents are maybe pushing an athlete beyond that athlete's comfort, or where they're sometimes abusive to staff or to young referees or coaches. In Calgary, and in Edmonton now I think too, if you want to register your kids in hockey, a parent in your family has to take the Respect in Sport Parents course. So that's an interesting process to think about, making parents go through a little bit of a step. I was mentioning to Tammy from U of A during our break that one of the things that's been interesting for us to see is the emergence of day camps, explosion of day camps. People offering day camps out of their private homes, out of beauty salons, out of arts organizations. And those sound like fun day camps. Hair and nail polish day camp, that could be the perfect thing for somebody. But if you're a business and you're becoming a youth-serving organization, what parents don't know is nobody is licensing them. In Alberta, at least, if you run a children's program for less than 2 months of the year, there's no licensing process. You can't license. You're not like a daycare. But people think a day camp is like a daycare. Your facilities might be hiring adults to do adult work and then also starting some kids programming. And so what I want to ask you is, if some of you said, we do this, yes, we do record checks and references for adults who work with youth, but what if those adults have worked there for 10 years? Do we have a process to then get those record checks? I worked with an organization for a while that had this policy written up that they would do record checks every 4 years. And I thought, oh, okay, every 4 years. Well, I said, do you have like a person and they have a record keeping system so the name comes up every 4 years? And I said kind of jokingly, like, do you do record checks in 2005 and 2009 and 2013? And if I start in 2006, I got 3 years until you check my records. And I sat with this board, and they all looked at each other, and they answered all different questions. Like they were like, yeah, that one, no, that one. They were doing this. And they had never gotten as far as to operationalize their policy, so they'd never done a record check. They'd had the policy for 10 years. People had been sending their children to sleepaway camp with this organization for 10 years under the understanding that at the very least there were child protection checks, criminal record checks, and references about their treatment of children, which is a different kind of reference than how did they interact with office mates. And they had never done one because they'd never got as far as figuring out how are we going to administer the policy that we have. Okay, so when we're starting to work with children and youth or with seniors or people with disabilities have a very, very alarmingly high incident of experiencing violence. Sometimes they have communication barriers that make it hard to say what's happening. Sometimes we don't believe them. So that's another population. We really want to look at what are the oversights in place when we're working with that population. So I'll look at this really quickly. So we should deal with risks because it's the right thing to do. But some of the other reasons, if you need to get your organization excited about dealing with their risk and liability, thinking about the ethics, thinking about the rights and safety of people, but also sometimes it's thinking about image. Sometimes image is the thing that sways people into action. Sometimes the worry about legal or financial liability is the thing that sways people into action. So those are some things that are just worth thinking about. What are the arguments you might need to make in your organization that help people to take action? And then I guess what I want to kind of close with is that one of the hardest things that can be for us to, that was not really a sentence in English. Let me try that one again. It's been a long day. One of the hardest things can be to confront barriers. So some of the barriers that come up when you're wanting to do risk management work, he says he's tired. I'm tired. I don't want to follow the woman in the blue shirt anymore. I'll just do a little dancing for it so it can liven up. One of the things that can be hard is confronting barriers. So the barriers might be a director, people don't value it. People don't want to do it. People don't want to remember. One of the things we need to do is have an institutional memory. I have worked with organizations in doing this workshop. This happened to me. I was at a conference, and 3 different people said to me, this could never happen in my organization. And I have been around the block for a long time. I've worked in my sector for about 15 years. Each of them came from an organization where I knew of an abusive power situation that their organization investigated of their own staff that they had never heard of. Sleeping with a client, staff sleeping with a client, or an embezzlement in one case. And so we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to remember. We don't want liability. Sometimes when we catch somebody doing something wrong, there's not a charge laid, and so they'll say, if you tell anybody about this, I'm going to sue you. But we need to have ways to learn from our own experiences. One of the ways that we do that at the Red Cross is we take cases where we could have done better, and we fictionalize them enough to protect the confidentiality of the people involved, and then we use them as case studies for training. So for example, we have had a couple of situations where somebody has attempted something in a disaster situation, or where we've been concerned about something and we've been able to look at a child protection issue and turn it into a training opportunity. So what we have, and we're a little bit out of time, but I've put a couple of case studies over there. So one of the examples, and I could send you case studies if you're interested. I will happily, if you give me your card, I'll send them to you. Write risk on it so I know which workshop you're in. One of the things we do is we take examples like, so you have an 18-year-old staff member who is asking out a 16-year-old participant. If you are not training for that possibility, you are missing the boat, because that is happening all the darn time. It's happening at day camps and summer camps and in teams. Staff attractions between teenagers can be fine, but you need to make sure that the situation is safe for that participant. And you need to make sure that there isn't a supervisory relationship. So what you could do is kind of look at what are the risk situations in my organization, and then turn those into training opportunities for new staff or into staff meetings to really look at where could risk come from. What do we do if we have an abusive coach? What do we do if we have a tyrant staff member? What process do we want people to follow? And then how are we going to support them when they do follow that process? So your handout gives you do you mind if I take this one? So it gives you a few places where you can kind of fill in some blanks based on what we've talked about. So mapping asks the question that I had on the slide. When you think about, on the 3rd page, creating a prevention team, there's a little spot there where you can write in some names. When you think about policies and procedures, think about the ones that are missing or the ones that you're unclear about. And then think about, what do you want to do next? I put 2 case study questions, 2 case study examples really briefly on the last page that you could use as a little bit of a training opportunity. But if you'd like more, we'd be really happy to share that with you. And again, if you go to redcross.ca and you look for risk management, or look under 10 steps, or if you try it and you can't find it, and you just email me. My email address is on the back page. And I will send you out the link so you can download the little workbook that gives you greater detail. Thank you very much. Thank you, camera, for filming me doing this. There is still some battery, so I would invite you when you leave to walk in front of the camera and do a little dance, because that makes the camera very happy.
Well, as we just said, was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
From part of the WCCRC organizational committee, thank you so much for
Oh,
taking the time
I
to be with
appreciate
us
it.
today.
Thanks.
It's great.
I meant that about the dancing. So you can just dance right here, near me. No, I have been filmed for 2 hours today. Feel free to dance right through here. Oh, my pleasure. Okay, I won't make the dancing happen. I'll turn it off like that.